Hello, Third Friday. Welcome to our first ever, so far as I know, recorded video book review. And just bear with me. This is really experimental today. So I'm reviewing today The Souls of Black Folk by William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, better known as W.E.B. Du Bois. He was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and it was a very small, close-knit community, a very integrated community. And so he was in a very sheltered existence for his early years until he came to Nashville, Tennessee in around 1886. And did his undergraduate work at Fisk University. And during that time, among other students, went out to teach in rural schools in the surrounding area. And he taught during the summer vacations at Watertown, Tennessee during that time. And that really gave him his first introduction to some of the more difficult racial relationships in our society. He went on to do graduate work at the University of Berlin and ultimately was the first African American awarded a doctorate from Harvard. He was a sociologist, historian, clearly a civil rights activist, also a socialist, an author, editor, pacifist, and a Pan-Africanist. He believed that folk descended from African roots worldwide should come together, had common interest, and should band together and work on those common interests. In his professional life, he taught at Atlanta University from 1897 till 1910, and it was during this time, in 1903, when he wrote The Souls of Black Folk. He also was a co-founder of the NAACP during that time, was the editor of their magazine, The Crisis. I believe he was the first editor of The Crisis, and alternated working with NAACP and Atlanta University off and on most of his career. In 1961, he joined the American Communist Party. His first wife had passed away. He had remarried, and his second wife was very influential in that move. Together they moved to Ghana at the behest of the president of Ghana and became citizens, and he died there in 1963. This particular book is a series of essays on the African American experience of our nation, their perspective on our life as citizens in our society, and it really is considered the seminal work of African American literature. The book has at its core the thesis that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, and it gives his perspective on that. And I'm going to read some from the book throughout, and we'll begin with the opening paragraph. Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, "How does it feel to be a problem?" they say, "I know an excellent colored man in my town," or "I fought at Mechanicsville," or "Do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil?" At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, "How does it feel to be a problem?" I answer seldom a word. So he begins with this picture of one who recognizes in himself and his race a problem for the larger majority society, and you get this picture of white folks dancing around this, but their perception is very much that he and others of his color are a problem. What I grew up hearing over the years was comments about America has to deal with racism in order to move on and to fulfill its vision and brightest hopes, or that we have to deal with the legacy of slavery and that sort of thing. What I came to see over time was that we all, in some way, were and are in bondage to this institution of slavery, that regardless of race, we are tied to that as a society. And now I see it more as being tied to this hierarchical worldview that feeds assumptions, expectations, even fear toward those who are different from us, and that is something we have to deal with not only as a society, but I think as human beings in order to move forward. And he speaks some of that in the book as well. And I'm reading again from the first chapter. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on it in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world in Africa. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. And I have heard of this double consciousness and have heard African American friends reflect on this, that they really see themselves as a foot in two very different worlds and trying to reconcile that, and feeling themselves valued and perceived through the filter of white consciousness. And so these are two principal themes in this book, this thing of the hierarchical worldview and this double consciousness. What I found was I expected kind of an angry writing. I expected to be made to feel guilty, and I was kind of bracing myself for that. Because after all, he has every reason to be angry at our society and demanding of change. But what I got from this was a very heartfelt, empathetic, nuanced perspective on my country and on my society. Sort of from someone who was an outsider on the inside, who could look at it with a more objective eye in many ways than I could. And he presents a perspective that I had not heard or contemplated. And that really is the problem. My expectation of him is rooted in a deep level of racism that's so buried inside of me, I'm not even aware of it. This assumption that the way things are is the way they all should be. But he presents this understanding that no, there is and should be entirely different perspective on my society and the way things should be, and a better way of seeing and being in our society. So what I'm going to share with you are some of the themes that kind of emerged for me that really stood out. One is his insight on sort of the evolution of hope among people of color, and he talks about how enslaved people truly believed if they could just be set free, that their problems would be solved and they'd be able to move on to a better life. And of course, we know that emancipation, freedom, did not really fulfill its promise. And so then they moved to a hope that the vote would secure their freedom. That if they registered to vote and elected officials who were sympathetic to their cause, that they could change the society and really secure a better life. And as we know, that was undermined in so many ways historically. And so then they put their hope in education. If we can just raise up children to be educated and learned and contributing members of society, then we can secure true freedom and a better life. And so you see the rise of historically black colleges and universities. What they found was there was no one to teach their children, and so they had to build their own colleges and universities to educate teachers who could then educate their children. So you see this progression of hope and thought among folk of color, and you see that reflected in Dr. King's leadership of the civil rights movement, this emphasis on anti-discrimination and integration and accepting people, voting rights, equality in education. You know, all of those things really spring from this evolution of hope. But what they found, and the truth we still wrestle with, is that even though progress was made, ultimately this sense of racial hierarchy that is so deeply embedded in us as a society, and I think as human beings, has proven insurmountable. And I remember a quote back in the 80s where an African-American leader said, you know, I can make you hire me, I can make you let me vote, but I can't make you like me. Can't make you express and appreciate me and respect me. So that's one of the things that for me was very telling, was this progression of hopes and the things that folk put their hope in. Another thing that struck me is that he gives a surprisingly empathetic view of both the African-American experience and white experience, that we are both victims of economic and political forces and a worldview that really has been driven, I think he would say, by greed and power, the search for greed, money and power. But that we're all victims of that, and most especially in the South, our dependence on slavery as the economic engine for the South, and our need, therefore, to control this large population of folk who we perceived as angry, violent, demanding of justice, has driven so much of this. And you'll see this empathetic view kind of woven through the book. He makes reference to a Southern gentleman and calling the South to its better self, to lift up the wonderful aspects of Southern culture and life. So that took me by surprise. Again, my prejudice. One area that really spoke to me, he places a premium on higher values above material wealth. And I'm going to read a couple of passages that reflect that. He says at one point, Atlanta must not lead the South to dream of material prosperity as the touchstone of all success. Already the fatal might of this idea is beginning to spread. It is replacing the finer type of Southerner with vulgar money-getters. It is burying the sweeter beauties of Southern life beneath pretense and ostentation. For every social ill, the panacea of wealth has been urged. Wealth to overthrow the remains of the slave feudalism. Wealth to raise the cracker third estate. Wealth to employ the black serfs. And the prospect of wealth to keep them working. Wealth as the end and aim of politics. Does that not sound familiar? And as the legal tender for law and order. And finally, instead of truth, beauty, and goodness, wealth as the ideal of the public school. And again, he later reflects on this. It is then the strife of all honorable men of the 20th century to see that in the future competition of races, the survival of the fittest shall mean the triumph of the good, the beautiful, and the true, that we may be able to preserve for future civilization all that is really fine and noble and strong, and not continue to put a premium on greed, impotence, and cruelty. What he's suggesting here is to me, it's not just a book about empowering African American citizens and freeing them and educating them and integrating them into a society. This is about what it is to be truly human in the best sense, and lifting up those core values that we as individuals and as a society need. And these values really are at the heart of our American ideal, but we have displaced them with an emphasis on the accrual of wealth and power. So, another theme that struck me, he begins each chapter with the words of what he calls the sorrow songs, the old spirituals and folk songs that were an expression of African American hopes and dreams. And I thought back, I remember Larry Irvin at Merrill College teaching me how before enslaved people could read or write or even express themselves freely, that they would express themselves through these old songs, sometimes out in the fields. That's how they would communicate with one another. In church, around the campfire. These are ways, these were ways they could express who they were and what was significant. So he brings one of these sorrow songs into every chapter and introduces every chapter. And it struck me, I turn my nose up at hip hop and rap. I've enjoyed jazz. It's not my favorite thing, but the truth is, these are all extensions of these ways of expressing through music, and it's worth paying attention in this age. In fact, he says at one point, there is no true American music but the wild, sweet melodies of the Negro slave. And truth is, that is our music. It has become our music, whether it's jazz, blues, hip-hop, rap, you name it. The book ends with a wonderful statement that touches on these songs and draws his thoughts together at the end. Would America have been America without her Negro people? Even so is the hope that sang in the songs of my fathers well sung. If somewhere in this whirl and chaos of things there dwells eternal good, pitiful yet masterful, then anon in his good time America shall rend the veil and the prison shall go free. Free, free as the sunshine trickling down the morning into these high windows of mine. Free as yonder fresh young voices welling up to me from the caverns of brick and mortar below, swelling with song, instinct with life, tremulous treble and darkening bass. My children, my little children, are singing to the sunshine, and thus they sing. Let us cheer the weary traveler, cheer the weary traveler. Let us cheer the weary traveler along the heavenly way. And the traveler girds himself and sets his face toward the morning and goes his way. I don't know about you, but I heard echoes of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech in that. And through this book, you do get sort of the wellspring that many of our great leaders have touched on. I saw resonance with much of Dr. King's teaching in the letter from Birmingham jail and that sort of thing. I have to say, I can understand, his affiliation with the American Communist Party and socialism and all of that, why he was kind of sidelined by mainstream literature in this country. But it's a beautifully written book. It's compelling. It's a call to our better angels. And again, has influenced many who came after. It should be required reading, I think, in our public school system. And I'm ashamed that after 70 plus years and having worked my way through the educational system from bottom to top, that I never read this book. So it should be required reading, and I feel like it is just as relevant now as it was at the turn of the last century, and that we have a fresh opportunity. There is a door opening for us as a society and as human beings to move into a higher level of thinking and seeing one another and dealing with each other. I think this book could help us walk through that. So look forward to talking with everybody, I hope, if our Zoom is successful on Friday. See you then.